this, as you can see, is the structure I was talking about, the cerebellum. As you can see, this is the cerebellum, and this is the fourth ventricle, which I was talking about. And here you have the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, where the CSF production takes place. And this is the connecting structures, the superior cerebral peduncle, middle cerebral peduncle, and the inferior cerebral peduncle, which connected to midbrain. This is on the top, pons, middle, and medulla oblongata. So moment there is a tumor or something which extends slightly beyond this, immediately will put pressure on this area, and this will put further pressure on these areas. So the brainstem area will be affected quite early, and in these areas, leading to features of uh, involvement of these organs. And there are lots of cranial nerve nuclei in this area, so you can expect some kind of cranial nerve abnormalities. The peduncles, as I've shown you, and this is the dentate nucleus. This is the nucleus which is there. Most important nucleus, dentate nucleus. The rest of the anatomy, I think you can check it from the textbooks. So lesions of midline group, the flocculonodal lobe, the vermis, if it is isolated off, you can say a tumor which is starting just exactly in the center, will produce very severe ataxia. And it will be a bilaterally symmetrical ataxia, as you can know, because the structure is midline. And the tumors also cause early headache and papilledema. The signs of lesions in the lobes, that is the anterior lobe or the posterior lobe, will depend on this which side, and it will be symmetry whether it is on both sides or not. Unilateral lesions usually produce cerebellar signs in limbs on the same side, as we have seen in the case which you have presented. Symmetrical bilateral hemisphere will cause mild signs and symptoms, and most severe symptoms when connections to the brainstem are affected. As I said, the moment a lesion starts going beyond the area of cerebellum and affects the brainstem, then the symptoms become more severe. And then you have other symptoms like visual impairment, cranial nerve involvement, more severe headache, corticospinal tract getting affected. All these symptoms will later on come. As you have already correctly said, I don't have to really lay a lot of stress on this, but the symptoms and signs which we know of cerebellar diseases are usually these kind of things. We have uh, uh, ataxia. What is ataxia? Basically, ataxia is kind of uh, incoordinated or inaccurate movement, which is not associated with paresis. What is important is that it is incoordinated or inaccurate, which is not due to paresis, which means paralysis, alteration in tone, loss of postural sense, or involuntary movements. So all these three things should first be ruled out. Then only we can say that the patient has ataxia in examination. Symptom may be ataxia. चलने में दिक्कत है, हाथ नहीं चल पाते, खाना हाथ से गिर जाता है, पैर से चप्पल फिसल जाता है. All these symptoms will be there, and we can suspect ataxia. So cerebellar functions are to be tested. The golden rule is that cerebellar functions are to be tested only when the motor system, the sensory system, and the posterior column sensations, they are normal. If suppose a patient has mild weakness, pyramidal weakness means lesions which is affecting the corticospinal tract and causing weakness, that may produce some amount of ataxia. So we cannot really be sure about ataxia. You can't comment on ataxia if the patient has corticospinal weakness. So that is why this is the golden rule in examination for ataxia, that we have to rule out first. So in motor system examination, if you see, the coordination part comes at the end, in the later part. Earlier you have to do the power, sense, and sensory examination, motor examination, and then you come to the coordination part. So once you find any abnormality in the motor weakness, or there's some motor weakness or corticospinal tract weakness or sensory loss, then ataxia cannot be said to be because of cerebellar lesion. Similarly, patients who are very anxious, as you have seen the testing, finger, nose, and all, they will not be able to perform it. They will be so anxious. Maybe if you're doing in a crowded OPD, and the extrapyramidal system doesn't have any abnormalities. If they are there, then we can't comment upon the ataxia part. So gait ataxia, as you have already known, feet are wide apart. Patient usually holds on to the support, reels from side to side even when supported. And in case it is a unilateral lesion, the patient will tend to uh, fall towards the same side, as might have been expected in your case also. That while talking about the his gait, a comment should have been made whether he was tending to fall towards one side, right side, or left side. That is always definitely done. Tandem walking, walking on the line, straight line, to detect minimal gait ataxia, it is to be done. If there is severe gait ataxia, then tandem walking is not to be attempted because it is of no utility. Patient already has gait ataxia, so it is to be done only when you are suspecting gait ataxia in a minimal level. Romberg's test, do we really do here or not? Because Romberg's test is a test for posterior column sensation. Okay, so if you have already tested for posterior column sensation, as is to be done in routine examination, then Romberg's test is not to be done as a test for cerebellar function. Okay, but if it has not been tested, then you can do it, because Romberg's positive usually means a Romberg's test again will not be impaired in patients of cerebellar disease. So it usually reflects the involvement of the posterior column. So Romberg's test is a testing of posterior column, we should remember, and not of a cerebellar function. From gait ataxia, the other thing is the truncal ataxia. Truncal ataxia usually has midline cerebellar lesions, is caused by midline cerebellar lesions, unable to sit or stand without support, tends to fall backwards. But this is again a symptom which was missing in the history, whether there was any truncal ataxia, inability to sit or stand in the bed or a chair, and then sometimes limb ataxia may not be present in patients with just truncal ataxia. So this history is again important in these cases. That is gait ataxia, the limb ataxia and truncal ataxia, gait ataxia and truncal ataxia. Then comes the limb ataxia. So we have the gait, the trunk, and the limb. And this is the limb ataxia which we have tested by these tests: the finger nose tests, the heel knee shin tests, and the rebound test. So it is basically a test of limb ataxia. So as I've tried to show it in this, most of you must be knowing it, but still for the sake of completion, I'm trying to show it here. Finger nose test and heel knee shin test. It is better always, as a rule, I would like to tell you that while doing these tests, patients may be a little uncomfortable doing them. because these kind of testing are usually not done in a routine clinical examination. The patient may have gone to some doctors and other thing. So the best thing to get good results in examination, when you are going for exam, or even when you are examining the patient practically, is to simply demonstrate it yourself. Just stand in front of the patient, make yourself the subject, and then show him how finger nose is done. Use your own right hand, touch your nose, and then make the patient as the examiner को उसको बोलो कि एक उंगली अपना रखिए और उसको करके दिखाओ, देखो ऐसे ऐसे जो है ना, the arm has to be kept little this thing, and we uh, move the finger like this. So arm has to be kept like this, and then not like this. It is like this, and then the person like this. It has to be kept, and then it goes straight. So you just make the patient, you yourself do it 3 or 4 को ऐसे करना है, ऐसे नाक को छूना है. ये तो most of the time you will find the patient will touch your nose, which is very embarrassing. The patient touches your nose and then you don't know what to do. So it's better to always demonstrate to the patient that what you have to do. अपना नाक छू के मेरा उंगली को छूना है, and then you kind of after you demonstrate it, then tell the patient to do it. Similarly, in the heel knee shin test, what is important that the heel is lifted up after it reaches the foot, and then it goes back to the knee. It should not slide down and up like that. It is very important that after the heel has reached the foot, it has completed the movement on the shin, it should be lifted up and then brought back on its own, and then again the same movement should be continued. Again, since you can't demonstrate it by lying down, you can just hold the patient's feet with your hand and then demonstrate it to them कि इसको ऐसे पकड़ के ऐसे ऐसे करना है, ऊपर उठाना है, ऐसे करना है. All neurological testing, especially sensory testing, coordination testing, it is important to demonstrate to the patient that what you are doing. Okay. Neurological examination, this is a very important, because patient cooperation, if it is not there, all your sensory and other examination will be of no use. It will just go waste, and the patient will give you kind of unclear answers which will lead to difficulty. So this is an important rule about kind of this thing. Rapid alternating movement, as you said, I've tried to give you a picture how it is done with left hand kept straight and right hand is moved like this, and a patient has to told to do it fast little so that he is able to improve this. And similarly, it can be done on the hand can be kept on the thigh also, and there it can there also it can be done. So these are the ways of doing. This is the best I can in the absence of a patient. I hope we will have a case demonstration someday and we will be able to demonstrate it to you. This is about rapid alternating movements, and if it is abnormal, it is called as dysdiadochokinesia, and if it is normal, it is called as diadochokinesia. So normal movement is diadochokinesia and abnormal is dysdiadochokinesia. This is another way of doing this by making the patient rotate his both the forearms around each other and changing the direction in between. So either the supination pronation of your hand on the other hand, or this kind of movement where your both the arms are rotated around each other. This is the way you can, another way of doing this rapid alternating movement. Ataxia is the most important symptom. Now other things, tremor. Now intention tremor, what do you mean by intention tremor? Intention tremor is something which you can see in the finger nose test also. It is something which a tremor or the shakiness of the limb which comes on when the patient is trying to move towards a target. जैसे हम उसको बोलते हैं कि आप टेबल पे कोई चीज पड़ा हुआ है उसको उठाइए हाथ से, तो जब तक वो हाथ को मूव करता है और जैसे ही वो उसके पास जाता है, स्पून है या ग्लास है, तो उसको टच करते ही उसके हाथ में शेकिंग शुरू हो जाती है. दैट इज कॉल्ड intentional tremor or positional tremor. That is typical of cerebellar lesions. This is one thing, because there are various other kinds of tremors also. So this is what speech is again called as staccato. Obviously, I really can't demonstrate, but it is like patient stops in between and मेरा तो ऐसा होता ही नहीं है. So this is a kind of staccato, means it stops in between. It's a term used from musical notes basically. So that is a staccato speech, which is typical of a cerebellar lesion. Again, these don't have any localizing values, these things, the tremor and the speech. Head posture, the head may sometimes, in some cases, not a very common feature, be tilted to one side. Or there may be a shaking of the head, which is called as titubation. Tone, as has been pointed out in the history, is reduced. Pendular jerk, this is something which was missing in the examination. Pendular jerk is a condition in which the reflex, and it is demonstrated only and only in the knee jerk. And the patient is made to sit on the edge of a bed or a chair or a couch, and the feet are kind of dangling on the surface, the air, and then we check for the knee jerk. I hope all of you know how a knee jerk is tested. And once the kind of the hammer hits the uh, tendon, it is found that instead of the reflex happening normally, it should go back to the normal position of rest. Instead of going that, it keeps on moving like a pendulum, or at least 3 to 4 movements will happen, and then it will come to rest. So pendular jerks are there. It is a feature of cerebellar disease, and it is said that it is happening because of hypotonia of both the muscles, the flexor as well as the extensor. Both are having hypotonia, so none of them is able to control the limb and bring it back to the normal uh, position. So this pendular jerk is again a feature which is usually seen in cerebellar diseases, cerebellar conditions, and is demonstrated only in a knee jerk. Okay, because other tests it is not possible to kind of keep the limb floating in the air and then let it freely move. So it is possible to demonstrate only in a knee jerk. Nystagmus again is something which we see on examination only, and nystagmus is tested again by telling the patient to move his hand as we try to move the finger in front of him. And typically in a cerebellar disease, it happens to uh, be increased as the patient looks towards the side of the lesion. Suppose in this patient, since it has right-sided lesion, left-sided this thing, so we will have, as the patient looks toward the left side, the nystagmus will get aggravated. So this is what we can say about nystagmus. Again, it doesn't have any much of a localizing value, and it may be absent in some cases. Vomiting again is a feature of the raised ICT. It is not something specific of cerebellar disease, but it's only when you have a tumor-like condition. It usually doesn't happen in patients. It doesn't happen in cerebellar degeneration, slowly progressive condition. Rapidly progressive conditions like tumor, hemorrhage, they will cause vomiting. And the features I've already told you, it will be positional and projectile. So in ataxic patients, since ataxia is the most important symptom, so we will try to figure out how to go about if the patient is having ataxia. First, you should try to know in the history whether it is symmetrical or focal, as has been correctly done in your case. You have found out that it's only on the one side. Time course, acute, subacute, chronic. It is hours to days, it is acute, days to weeks, subacute, months to years, chronic. Okay. Is it isolated or part of multi-system neurological disorder? That will be seen if there are corticospinal weakness, if there is nuclear cranial nerve involvement, and other symptoms are there. So that gives us idea, as I've already told you, whether it has spread beyond this thing or not. Conditions which are acute, have symmetrical and progressive signs, usually will be because of drugs, and the most common drug which we use uh, are the anti-epileptics like phenytoin. Is known to cause ataxia if it is taken, if the blood levels increase slightly. You know from pharmacology that phenytoin has a very peculiar kind of pharmacodynamics, because of which the levels can raise very high in a particular person. So phenytoin is one very common drug. So any patient with symmetrical and progressive signs, short history of drug intake, especially anti-epileptics. It can happen with other anti-epileptics also, but most common with phenytoin. Alcohol intake, as you all know, post-alcohol intake, you have that kind of ataxia, but alcohol intake for a long time can also lead to some kind of chronic this thing. Viral infections uh, in the form of encephalitis can lead to acute onset of ataxia, a condition which is sometimes called as cerebellitis. It is a kind of infection which affects the cerebellum itself and leads to inflammation of the cerebellum, and that causes cerebellitis. So patient has a very short history of fever, cough, sore throat, may or may not be, and then you have this kind of ataxia which goes away within a week or 10-15 days. And then there's another specific post-infectious syndrome which is seen in varicella, chickenpox, which is obviously not so common nowadays because of chickenpox becoming rarer with each passing day. So these are some conditions which cause symmetrical symptoms, acute onset. Okay. Then the second group is subacute, where the symptoms are present over days to weeks. There will be history of toxins, especially and which are industrial use. So occupational history is important. Mercury is definitely not being used much days. Just to complete the list, vitamin deficiency, especially vitamin B12, vitamin B1 deficiencies, they are very important for these kind of this thing. Lyme disease, we don't see much in our condition, but just to complete the list. Then we come to the chronic group. This is what we are interested, because this patient which we have seen as having chronic. So a very important cause of chronic symmetrical and progressive will be paraneoplastic syndrome. Paraneoplastic, I hope you know, it is a condition which is caused, which is there's a malignancy somewhere in the body, and the symptom which is happening here is not related to that particular organ, but it is related to some other organ. Suppose there is the common paraneoplastic syndrome which is seen is Hodgkin's disease, or a patient with carcinoma lung. They may present with paraneoplastic syndrome with ataxia as a feature. So the patient has bilaterally progressive symmetrical ataxia over months of 3 to 4 months. Then paraneoplastic syndrome should be one of the differential diagnoses. Okay, for that we may have to do the scanning of other organs. So other systemic examination important is very, very important, and history taking is very, very important, because paraneoplastic syndrome can be a feature of this thing. Anti-gliadin antibody is, as you may be aware, some of you, it is an antibody which is commonly seen in patients with where we have this possibility of gliadin antibody development, which leads to diarrhea and GI symptoms. So these patients may have so any patient who has progressive chronic ataxia, the testing which you were talking about in your case, and there is no evidence of any tumor in that case, so chronic case is there, so their anti-gliadin antibody should be tested, and treatment for anti-gliadin antibody has been shown to improve the ataxia in many of these cases. Okay, hypothyroidism, phenytoin toxicity taken over a long time, and then inherited disease. This is an important group, because there are many conditions of which are inherited, which may present early also and which may present late. In medicine, we are more concerned with the one which are presenting in the adult age group. That will come to a little later. From after talking about symmetrical and progressive, we move on to focal and ipsilateral signs, as is your case. So if it is an acute onset focal ataxic symptoms, the first thing which we have to think about is a vascular cause, as is always the condition, which may be in hemorrhage of superior cerebellar artery, or we may be having infarction, stroke, like a posterior fossa stroke, or a cerebellar abscess may be there. So there may be history of seizures also, or there may be just history of severe headache, fever, and then this kind of ataxic symptoms. Subacute history, weeks to months, neoplastic, as was there in your case, sclerosis, AIDS-related multifocal leukoencephalopathy. So if the MRI testing is normal, or if you want to do initial screening, then HIV testing should also be done in these patients in which the MRI testing is normal. Chronic or weeks to months to years, stable gliosis secondary to a vascular lesion, congenital lesion like Chiari malformation, which is not possible to discuss here. So these are all conditions which will have discussed in your pediatrics. These are all congenital malformations which can present slowly. They don't present acutely, they present slowly over 5-6 years of age. Gradually progressive ataxia can be there. These are focal and ipsilateral signs. Now coming on to the inherited ataxic disorders to complete, because this is a very important group and it includes some very interesting conditions. Just briefly going through this, spinocerebellar ataxia type 1, as you have highlighted in your differential diagnosis. It has early or middle age onset. All these features are there. And on MRI, we see cerebellar and brainstem atrophy is there. So this is type 1. We have type 1 to type, I think 40 or 42 has been, obviously this is the most common one. SCA2 is of interest to us because it has been shown that in Indian population, this is a very common ataxia. Age of onset can be between 2 to 65 years of age. All these ataxias are seen in adult population. So any adult who has come to you with a bilaterally symmetrical, slowly progressive ataxia, where the other symptoms or other features are not there or other investigations are normal, then you should think of spinocerebellar ataxia. There can be clinical variability within families. SCA3, 6, 7, and the list is very long. So then we come on to this condition, which is of interest to us, but we should understand this Friedreich's ataxia. It is an autosomal recessive. All these conditions which we had discussed, these spinocerebellar, these are all autosomal dominant. The spinocerebellar, the Friedreich's ataxia is autosomal recessive. What is the most interesting thing is that if you do the histopathology or this thing or testing of the patient, the cerebellum is usually normal in these patients. But it is not exactly a cerebellar disease. It's a disease which affects usually the spinal cord, the upper cervical spinal cord, especially the posterior columns and the other tracts in that. So that is what is affected. The cerebellum is not affected that much. So it is not exactly a cerebral, but it is an ataxic disorder. It very nicely highlights the fact that even in the absence of a cerebellar disease, you can have an ataxia. The interesting thing is it usually has an onset before 25 years. So any onset after 25 years, unlikely to be Friedreich's ataxia. So by 15 to 20 years, most of the cases will start. Interesting point, which as sometimes in Viva these questions are asked, or in your multiple choice, it has an ataxia with areflexia. The reflexes are impaired. The reasons why reflexes are impaired is because there is associated peripheral neuropathy also in these patients. Then we have an extensor plantar reflex, which makes it all the more intriguing that how can you have extensor plantar reflex and areflexia? Because the corticospinal tract lesion, which we know of, usually has hyperreflexia and then the extensor plantar reflex. So this extensor plantar reflex getting affected is because the motor tracts in the spinal cord, as I said, they are impaired, they are affected. So that leads to extensor plantar reflex. And because of the peripheral nerves getting affected, there is areflexia. So these two things, so it's a kind of a myoneuropathy condition which is happening. So that leads to vibration and position sense defects, again because of posterior column getting affected. Cardiomyopathy is known to occur in almost 2/3 of cases, maybe not in the initial phase, but ultimately it leads to cardiomyopathy in most of the cases. Scoliosis is there in majority of the cases. Pes cavus, that is curved foot. ECG abnormality, interestingly, has been shown to be present in almost 70 to 80% of patients, even before the onset of ataxia. And the ECG abnormality most commonly seen in these cases is T-wave inversion in the ECG. So you have T-wave inversion in these cases. Diabetes may happen in around 20 to 30% of these patients. So these are all extra neurological abnormalities, which make it all the more interesting, challenging, and sometimes diagnosis may become possible only because of these features. You may do an echocardiogram and find a cardiomyopathy. We know that this could be a case of Friedreich's ataxia. Treatment obviously is there's no treatment for all these inherited conditions. Supportive care is all what we can offer. But these ECG abnormalities, the presence of diabetes, the scoliosis. So when you examine a patient, you have to do a full systemic examination because you have to pick up the signs of scoliosis, the pes cavus, The cardiomyopathy signs may be in failure also. History of diabetes may be there. So these are interesting points I try to highlight in brief of Friedreich's ataxia, since it happens in adult age group about 12 years. So we need to be aware of it. So this is all I have. And then there's one more condition which you should be aware of. That is ataxia telangiectasia, which are, as the name suggests, presentation, and the tumor is already showing that, then there is no need to do other testing. If this is what your question has your means, so you won't do any further testing. But usually MRI, if not done earlier, or if MRI is found to be normal or doesn't show any specific abnormality, because as I said, in cerebellar degeneration cases, inherited ataxias, these degeneration may not show early in the cases. So to complete the battery of tests, obviously these tests are not very simple to perform, genetic testing and all. Yes, checking for vitamin levels, checking for thyroid levels, checking for anti-gliadin antibodies, vitamin E levels. I just failed to mention there is one inherited ataxia. It's a very rare one in which डॉक्टर भदौरिया से करवा लो यार, भदौरिया साहब बैठे हैं ना, सुनो. So we have kind of vitamin E deficiency ataxia is also there, in which congenital defect is there in uh, 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 production of some vitamin E deficiencies there. So that can also lead to ataxia. It's a rare condition, but we can sort of uh, check the vitamin E levels if other investigations are found to be normal. Again, it is not a easily available test, so it needs to be uh, done with the other options have been explored. So checking for thyroid level, checking for vitamin levels, checking for mm, uh, kind of uh, so these things will So it may be cord, it may be cerebellum features, it may be cranial nerve. So ataxia of unusual presentation, obviously, it is not the first differential diagnosis. It is usually a differential diagnosis which we make a little late. Uh, so we have to uh, kind of keep it as a differential diagnosis where uh, the other possibilities have been ruled out. So hemiplegia may be there, may not be there, but if only ataxia is there, but you must know how to do the cerebellar testing, like testing for coordination, like testing for gait, doing the finger nose test, doing the heel knee shin test. This is important because this can be uh, 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 asked specifically in a patient. And the golden rule, which I told, which you should always remember, is if there is corticospinal tract or any neurological weakness, motor weakness, sensory defects, posterior column defects, or any specific extrapyramidal weakness, then the testing for cerebellum testing, all these tests, the finger, nose, and all, they cannot be done. So if you have a patient with a corticospinal tract like a hemiplegia, paralysis, and the examiner tells you, have you done the cerebellar testing? As a smart student, you should not be saying, "Sir, I forgot to do it." You must say that it could not be done, it cannot be done because the patient already has grade 3 weakness on one side. So you cannot do testing of even on the others normal side. आप कहेंगे एक साइड पावर 2 है या 1 है, चलो कर लेते हैं, उसमें आप कर ही नहीं सकते क्योंकि वो टेस्टिंग का वैल्यू ही नहीं है वहां पे कुछ भी। थोड़ा अटेक्सिया मोटर वीकनेस से भी आ सकता है, तो उसके लिए you don't have to really say that I forgot it, yeah, I was not done it. No, in a patient, or similarly, if has a sensory hemisensory loss or other sensory problems because of which sensations are impaired. So what is important that you have to be clear that these tests for cerebellar testing, which I have described today, they cannot be tested for. They don't carry any value in those cases. So neither do it, or if sometimes the examiner tries to catch you by asking, have you done cerebellar test? Will you do finger nose test? Why have you not done? So your answer should be that it can't be done because it doesn't have much value in this case. So that is how you kind of approach this case. So that is the important thing which you should remember. Obviously, and again, I would like to highlight that these are tests which are not done routinely in a patient, maybe of 70-year-old, he may have gone to doctor 10, 20 times in his life, but these tests may have never been done. So you should always demonstrate the patient that finger, nose, ऐसे करके दिखाओ, उसे करके दिखाओ. This holds true for all neurological examination where patient cooperation is required. When you're doing a finger pin test, we always tell the to show the pin to the patient. ये सुई है, देखिए इससे हल्का हल्का सा आपको हो रहा है ना दर्द, यहाँ पे हाथ में लगा दो या जहां आपको लगता है नॉर्मल है, ये मैं आपके यहाँ लगा के आपसे पता करूंगा कि आपको दर्द हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है. डोंट सडनली पिक अप द पिन एंड स्टार्ट प्रेसिंग इट इन द फुट एंड जस्ट सडनली आस्क हिम दर्द हो रहा है, दर्द हो रहा है. दैट मे लीड टू पेशेंट बिकमिंग स्टार्टल्ड. He may become suddenly uncomfortable. We don't know the psychological setup of the patient. The patient may suddenly stop cooperating with you, and all your hard work of history taking will go to waste if you just suddenly poke a pin inside and he decides to kind of uh, not cooperate with you. So it is important that uh, in neurological testing where you need uh, cooperation of the patient has to perform some act, you demonstrate to him properly, and then you go. Even when do checking for hammer testing, like reflexes, you must show him that this is something which I'm going to hit you, so दर्द नहीं होगा, आपको थोड़ा चेकिंग करना है. तो हर एक टेस्टिंग में आपको पेशेंट को बताना है कि what am I about to do and what will it kind of lead to. So this is important. तो इसीलिए patient cooperation in testing में, क्योंकि these are very patient centric tests, require full cooperation of the patient, so you need to uh, tell the patient that what you are about to do with this. You just can't simply tell him कि नाक पर छुओ. 5 out of 10 times the patient will check your touch your nose, which will be very embarrassing for you. I think we have done with most of the presentations, and I have, yes, there is one more question. Papilledema. What is papilledema? Yes, you do check for papilledema in patients. You do check for papilledema in all patients who are presenting with acute and subacute symptoms where we suspect raised ICT. Obviously, in chronic patients, it may not be so essential because if papilledema is present, it indicates a kind of a medical emergency. Then you can't wait for the patient to get a date for MRI after 5 days or 7 days. If you have papilledema in a patient presenting with headache with some ataxic signs, then it is an emergency. Why? Because cerebellar tumors, as I said, they can very quickly spread to involve the the brainstem. And if the brainstem gets affected, then your response to surgery and recovery may be very poor, and we may not get that kind of good response. So if papilledema is there, then measures to reduce the raised ICT have to be taken, and an urgent radiological investigation has to be carried out, and then a neurosurgical opinion has to be taken for early uh, surgical evacuation of the patient. Because if any delay is there, then it spreads to the brainstem or midbrain. The consequences can be very, very bad for the person. I think this is all I can take time out. So superficial, do we have to do superficial reflexes in every case? The patient has difficulty in turning around immediately when calling from behind. It is more likely to be vestibular lesion or cerebellar lesion? No, vestibular lesions will always have history of vertigo. They'll always have a significant history of vertigo. Vertigo and vomiting will be prominent symptoms, not that much of ataxia. So what you will have is more of vertigo and vomitings. So patient will tend to fall while walking, and ataxia will be there, tinnitus will be there, and that is something typical of vestibular lesions. So ataxia, gait ataxia, limb ataxia will not be, it will be more of vertigo, which is not related to movement. While sitting also the patient will feel that his head is reeling kind of thing. But here you have specific tests to check for. And these tests will usually be normal in that patient because there is no motor involvement in that patient. That is important. Another thing is, do we do superficial reflexes in every case? Yes, it's a part of routine testing, and since they have shown, usually superficial reflexes are very difficult to elicit, especially the uh, abdominal reflex and all. They may be absent in these cases. The diagnostic value of superficial reflexes is only in patients who have corticospinal tract lesions. Otherwise, they don't have much value. So, but you should know how to do it. Uh, Plantar reflex is obviously to be done in all cases, whatever may be the this thing. But abdominal and cremasteric you can choose to do only in specific cases where you have suspecting a corticospinal tract lesion, where you have the possibility that uh, it may turn out to be abnormal. But testing is not, uh, if not done properly, then the report may not be, and it gets affected by a lot of things. Patient is very obese, then the abdominal reflex may not be done if it is not done properly. So you may not be able to elicit that reflex. But yes, you must know how to do it. And wherever you have motor weakness like presentation, then superficial reflexes are a must to be done. Vestibular lesion, I've already told you what kind of symptoms you have. It is more of vertigo. I meant abdominal reflexes. Yes, abdominal reflexes you should do in all patients. I would recommend that because you will get used to doing it. That is the only thing. It may not help you in making a diagnosis unless it's a corticospinal tract lesion, but there is no reason not to do an abdominal reflex. Cremasteric is obviously something which requires a little bit of privacy and patient discomfort is there. So you may choose to do cremasteric only in a selected case, but abdominal reflex, obviously you should do it in all patients. Obviously the result has to be interpreted with caution, because absent abdominal reflex may not always mean that there is a corticospinal tract. You have to look for other uh, mm, findings which point towards a corticospinal tract lesion. So just the absence of abdominal reflex cannot be taken as doesn't have a very high diagnostic value. But yes, since it's mentioned in most of the examination schedules, so that is important. Slipping of slippers. Will slipping of slippers without patient noticing it occur in ataxia? No. Slipping of slippers is basically a symptom of weakness of intrinsic muscles of the foot. Is it okay? Intrinsic muscles of the foot. When they are affected, then only the patient will have slipping of slippers, or if there is The causes for that could be various, and the most important cause is obviously peripheral neuropathy. Uh, Ataxia may it will not be there because obviously there is no sensory loss in the patient and power is normal. So it is if it is pure ataxia and cerebellar ataxia especially. Yeah, as I said, ataxia can be there in a patient with motor weakness also. So posterior column sensation impaired जहाँ होंगी वहां पे भी ataxia हो जाएगा पेशेंट को. तो वहां पे अगर neuropathy has been there for a long time and it has led to loss of sensations over the foot and associated with intrinsic muscle weakness also, because then there may be, but not in a typical cerebellar ataxia case. We're discussing cerebellar ataxia here. Ataxia in itself will include other things also.